Good morning, everybody. My name is Patty Torsney, and I'm the permanent observer for the Inter-Parliamentary Union at the United Nations. As most of you know, the IPU has been a permanent observer to the UN for about 20 years, just over 20 years. And my colleague Alessandro Motter is here as well as our senior advisor. The debate on the future of multilateralism is really heating up at the United Nations, particularly in New York, in the run-up to next year's Summit of the Future, and a recent report of the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. That report identified ways that the UN could be more effective and networked and inclusive and engage a variety of stakeholders such as civil society, the private sector, local and regional governments. The IPU submitted a suggestion to the High-Level Advisory Board, and we have made a number of recommendations over the years for how to engage parliamentarians most effectively. We are very pleased to have with us three panelists this morning. We have Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's the CEO of New America, who's a very well-regarded foreign policy analyst and a member of that high-level advisory board. We have the esteemed, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Pakistan to the United Nations, Munir Akram, who is very seasoned in UN affairs, and so we're very pleased for him to participate today. And lastly, we have Guy Ryder, who is the Undersecretary General for Policy at the United Nations, and many of you know him as the former Director General of the ILO, the International Labour Organization, who worked well with IPU at that time as well. I'll turn to each of the panelists for about 5 minutes and ask them to elaborate on this report and their position on it. We did ask for 3 leading questions to be considered, and those are the new proposals for greater inclusion of civil society, the private sector, and local authorities in UN processes significantly different from existing consultative arrangements? And the second question was, does the role of parliaments at the UN differ from that of other stakeholders? I think we think it does. So we can elaborate on that. And the third question was, how can parliaments help strengthen people's faith in multilateralism and the United Nations? And so without further ado, I will turn to Anne-Marie Slaughter and ask for her opening remarks, and then I will turn to Ambassador Akram. Anne-Marie, over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be able to address you. I was writing articles and then indeed a book about legislative networks, parliamentary networks, certainly including the IPU as early as 1994. So, and then my book talking about parliamentary networks and many others was 2004. So it's really an honor to be able to talk to all of you today. And I will also begin by saying my experience on the high-level advisory board was really quite transformative for me. It was a very serious group of people that reflected the population of the world. What I think of, well, four Asian countries, 3 African countries, 1 North African, Middle Eastern, 2 European from Northern and Southern Europe, and 2 from the Americas, 1 from North America and 1 from South America. And the discussions very much reflected that global set of perspectives, which I know is not unusual for the United Nations, but is, I think, certainly was unusual for me as an American and as a former American government official. And I think I would start by saying we worked in an atmosphere of recognition that the world faces a set of existential problems that cannot be solved by states alone. And that is really a very different place than 1945 or 1965 or 85 or even 95, although by 1995, many of these problems were emerging. So that if the United Nations was set up to avoid the scourge of war, as it was, after two horrific global wars that had been started by states, one state or group of states invading another, and it was aimed at addressing those issues. And those were issues that, since states gave those orders, states could also refrain from giving those orders and come to one another's defense. It was entirely a state-based system. And that system remains critically important. We still have those problems, not just the war in Ukraine, but when I talked to the head of the ICRC in Geneva, there are 100 conflicts that rise to the attention of the ICRC, and many of them are state-based. So that infrastructure, that global system remains absolutely essential. But in addition, that we face existential problems of climate, of pandemics, of food and water and energy shortages, still of terrorism. And these are problems every bit as grave as the threat of nuclear war or whatever other 20th century scenario you care to focus on. Even the United States National Security Strategy recognizes that for the very first time. And so our focus was, what is effective multilateralism in this world, where we are facing problems that simply cannot be sufficiently addressed by states, because you have, for just to think of climate change, you have corporations, you have civic groups, you have mayors, you have governors, you have religious groups, all of which their resources need to be harnessed. And as always, very hard to get people to apply their resources to solutions if they're not part of at least thinking through those solutions. And so we started there with a people-centered multilateralism from really the work of the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, but also, I would say, very much from the focus of the SDGs, because the SDGs are a blueprint for this people-centered multilateralism. They are focused much more on people and on the planet than they are simply on interstate relations. So then the question is, how do you bring those two systems together? One that is very highly elaborated, the United Nations system, and that does certainly bring others in, but to go to the first question, primarily as observers rather than actors. And we focused on two things. One, the need absolutely to not only preserve, but to strengthen the United Nations system, with the recognition that states remain the most legitimate actors in the world, and for some purposes, still the strongest actors in the world. So there's no effort to erase that, even if one could, but there's every need to connect that state-based system to the global system that engages all these other actors. And if you think about it, think about the Paris conference, the environmental conference, not the peace conference, but you see, obviously state-based actors or states making these critical decisions, but you also see that you must have the corporations, the civic groups, and all these other groups. The same is true if you think about vaccines and the pandemic. You simply cannot do it states alone. So our proposals do go beyond observer status and the existing system. I would say they are recommendations to the member states to come together and think through this themselves. We did not say you must do X. We did say we developed 10 principles of effective multilateralism, and inclusion is one, true representation is another, and that goes for representation among states, that small minorities should not be able to block large majorities. And that has to be a decision-making procedure that states need to address. But we also focused on the need for networks. The value of networks is that you bring together what already exists rather than creating ever more new institutions. And here's, I think, the biggest difference. We said, look, effective multilateralism has to be mission-focused and accountable. And mission-focused means, just to take one example, if you are thinking about vaccines, or you are thinking about cures for, say, the next pandemic, you need relatively smaller hubs to bring together all the different actors with a very clear, concrete mission, one that can be measured. Here I draw on the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who always uses the example of putting a man on the moon, but something very, very focused where you bring all those energies together. And that would certainly include, where relevant, national parliaments, but often what you need are the health authorities, the pharmaceutical companies, the civic organizations, and global and regional organizations where parliaments are represented. So that's the first thing. I do think it is a call for a very different set of networked arrangements that are focused and mission driven, but that are completely connected to the UN system or to regional organizations. On the second question, yes, the role of parliamentarians differs than other stakeholders, but in an unusual way, because you are directly represented in the governments in a way, certainly, that universities or civic organizations or corporations or faith-based organizations are not. You are part of the governments. And I know the relations between my own legislature and the executive on foreign policy, and I understand that is complicated, but honestly, I'd rather be a senator than a CEO in terms of my ability to influence the multilateral system. So it is a special role, but it's a special role that is already folded into the idea of a state-based organization, and that's something we should discuss. And then finally, how can parliaments strengthen people's faith in multilateralism? This goes to the heart of what we were about. Our charge was effective multilateralism. The way to strengthen faith in multilateralism is for multilateralism to work. And when people see that we have a problem, like so many, that no one government can solve, whether that's an economic issue, a health issue, a peace and security issue, if they then see, but we go to a multilateral organization and something happens. And I would give the example of the G20 in the financial crisis of 2008, where it was possible for those 20 governments coming together and their finance ministers to make a real difference in avoiding what was a horrific recession from becoming another decade-long global depression. Then they believe. And parliamentarians then have the job of working with the executives of their governments, depending on the parliamentary or presidential system, to do the work to make multilateralism work. I'll conclude with this. I am a committed multilateralist. I do believe that in a very deeply connected world with a proliferation of organizations, that networks are the way to go. But I am deeply concerned that if the United Nations cannot reform itself through the SDGs, through the Summit for the Future, these are, again, very closely aligned, that it will simply be bypassed continually by regional organizations. There's a long history there, but also increasingly simply by clubs, and that the G20 is just one, and there will be many others, G things, sometimes with other letters before them, depending on what the subject is. And in those groups, parliamentarians will have less power than ever. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Emery. That's some good food for thought. And we will now turn to Munir Akram, who's the ambassador for Pakistan to the United Nations. And just a reminder that this meeting is being recorded, and it will be posted on our website through the YouTube channel. So you will be able to watch this again if there's anything that you're missing now. And so without further ado, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you for putting this meeting together. It's an important issue which has not been discussed frankly and openly at the United Nations, and even the high-level panel was in fact a restricted panel, and we most of us received the report just recently. And I would like to offer the contrary view to what Madam Slaughter has just presented. First of all, the state system, has it changed since 1945? Yes, there are large multinational corporations, but there used to be multinational corporations at that time too. They were different. Yes, there are more civil society organizations which are active, but the fact is that here is the first inequality. Most of these stakeholders that are spoken of, both the private sector and civil society, most of these stakeholders are in the north. There are very few fledgling in the south. Just look at the example of COVAX. Now, COVAX was set up, and yes, it brought in funding, but the decision-making on vaccine distribution, production, it was in the hands of the private sector, hands of those who provided the money to COVAX, not in the hands of the WHO, where member states were represented, and therefore developing countries had very little voice in that example. Look at the example of the IT sector, which is dominated by large companies and platforms located mostly in 2 countries of the world. They dominate the standards on IT. And what the member states are trying to do at the moment is trying to find ways of how to regulate the sector, of how to make it uniform, how to make it accountable as such for disinformation, for misinformation, for integrity of information. All of that is the government's trying to regulate these stakeholders as such. Therefore, I think the international system is still a member state system. And the United Nations in particular, the Charter says, it is an organization consisting of membership, which is of member states. And therefore, although private sector, other stakeholders can and should participate, provide inputs, provide the information, provide advice, etc. But the decision-making, at least as far as the United Nations is concerned, we have to continue to be decisions taken by member states. And therefore, stakeholders, other stakeholders cannot be put on an equal footing with member states. There is vast differences. Let me just list a few things. First of all, most stakeholder groups have no membership ties to the United Nations or the UN system. Secondly, there is no common rule book for decision-making in processes where these multi-stakeholders, these stakeholders are involved. There's no common basis for decision-making. Thirdly, there are no rules to address conflicts of interest. Those people who give money to COVAX, how much did they influence things to their commercial advantage? It's a question that we need to examine. And you know, The civil society for financing for development organization, for example, has said, let me quote something they said. This multi-stakeholderism dangerously conflates duty bearers, that is governments, rights holders, people, and corporate interests as equal stakeholders, while rendering invisible the historical asymmetries of power and voice between and within nations. So this is the issue for us. How do you address the conflicts of interest between a corporation and its participation in decision-making, which affects its own interests and profits? Yes. There are no standards for disclosure of the agenda, decisions, financing, expenditures, payments to participant members by these stakeholders. And this is something that obviously is an avenue through which decision-making can be corrupted. Finally, there are no formal rules on responsibility, obligation, or liability of individual members of the so-called multi-stakeholder groups. So until these issues are addressed, I think this multi-stakeholder approach is a dangerous approach, which is going to erode the United Nations. It's going to erode the power and influence of the developing countries because they do not possess these multi-stakeholders, mostly come from the north. And therefore, we see the move in the high-level panel's report on multi-stakeholder and network stakeholder approach as a dangerous approach for the United Nations and for the developing countries. And yes, of course, I do not believe that you can conflate the creation of a G20 with the absence of multi-stakeholderism in the United Nations. Would the United Nations become more relevant? Would there not be a G20 or a SCO or a BRICS or other organizations? These organizations are themselves member state-driven organizations. And member states will have groupings that are more exclusive to themselves. But I do not believe that the absence of multi-stakeholderism is what is driving the creation of these smaller or exclusive organizations. I think what we need to do is to strengthen the member state-driven organization, which is the United Nations, and that the member states should have the authority and the power and the ability to control the activities of civil society and of the private sector as a basis of creating effective multilateralism. That is the root. Strengthen member states, not strengthen those who are trying to weaken member states. And I think that this is an approach which deserves to be very carefully and cautiously approached as such. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We'll now turn to Guy Ryder for about 5 minutes as well. I know this is a very hot topic for everybody, and we do want to have some questions and comments from our members, particularly on the role of parliamentarians overseeing their governments and the decisions that they're taking. Mr. Ryder.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Paddy. Thank you for including me in this conversation, and greetings. It's great to reconnect with the IPU. I suppose, having heard two somewhat divergent views from the preceding speakers, you expect me to sort of reconcile and bring things together in a classically UN sort of way forward. But I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that. But let me just add my own perspectives on what my two fellow presenters have said. Let's first go back to those three important words about what the Secretary General is seeking to do with the proposals that he has tabled, particularly in the context of the Common Agenda and the Summit of the Future. This is to make multilateralism more networked, more inclusive, and more impactful. And by the way, I agree wholeheartedly that in the end, the judgment that people and the parliamentarians who represent them will make of multilateralism will ultimately depend on the results that multilateralism is able to deliver. That is the bottom line. Networked means, I think, networking in two respects. One, which is the subject of this conversation, but there's another one which is equally important. Networking internally, that is to say, the different parts of the multilateral system need to network and connect much better than they currently do. It's not the subject of today's conversation, but I think it's a very important accompaniment of the things we're discussing. And then there is a networking externally. But you mentioned that for a while I was in charge at the International Labour Organization. Some of you have gone back to 1945. Let me get in the time machine and take you back to 1919, when the very first multilateral organization, which still survives, was set up. Governments decided it was a good idea, not just to sit down and talk about economic and social matters between themselves, but to include employers and workers as decision-making partners. When you talk about a member state at the ILO, you don't just talk about governments, you talk about governments, employers, and workers. That is unique in the multilateral system. It's not exactly what we're talking about today, but it does make the point, and there is a lot of experience to prove it, that there is added value in terms of effectiveness and impact in reaching out purely beyond governmental circles. That does nothing whatsoever to negate the fundamental point made by Ambassador Akram, that member states' governments retain decision-making prerogatives by virtue of what's in the Charter and everything else. And that is not in question. I think the proposition is somewhat different. The proposition is that multilateralism can operate better across these three dimensions that those buzzwords indicate, by networking more effectively with different stakeholders. Why is that? I think there's two or three things that those stakeholders bring to the table. Firstly, they have knowledge and expertise which is not necessarily ready available in government. Let me give you one example. More and more we are thinking about how we are going to deal with artificial intelligence. It is perhaps the issue of the moment. I use it as an example. Is it reasonable to believe that governments in the UN or elsewhere are going to be in a position to make well-informed and adequate decisions about how we manage artificial intelligence without, in one manner or another, involving the industry which is driving the developments in artificial intelligence? So multi-stakeholders bring knowledge and expertise that we need to inform governmental decision-making. Secondly, I think also it depends on the constituency involved. They bring views, they bring opinions, they bring interests. And I think Ambassador Akram is right to point to those who are duty holders, those who are rights bearers, those who have interests. I think there are distinctions to be made there, but all are valid. None of those, I think, descriptions invalidate the participation of those concerned. Of course, we have to manage those interventions and the manner of participation in the most appropriate way. My point here is the UN has everything to gain from this type of networking. To turn to the questions that you put, and I think you want us to address those questions, is what is proposed in the common agenda different from what we already have? It builds on what we already have. I think the intent is to render this networking, this interaction, more systematic. It's not sort of a patchwork, but something built into the system. More meaningful. It's not simply turning up and being able to say something at the UN or have a photograph. It's actually being able to have some sort of traction on processes. By the way, that is coming out very clearly in the manner in which the Secretary General wants to engage better with youth, with representatives of young people. We have a youth office. He wants to involve youth much more meaningfully in the way decisions are taken. I think it also relates to the evolving relationship with the private sector and indeed to local and regional governments. So yes, this is, I think, a step forward in terms of the nature of interaction. Is interaction with parliamentarians different from that that we have with other stakeholders? Most definitely, yes. for three reasons that I can see. One, again, relates to the democratic mandate that is held by parliamentarians. It does respond to some of the concerns that might be expressed with relation to other stakeholders, but also, of course, parliamentarians have legislative and budgetary responsibilities, which make them distinctively different, and I might add, distinctively important stakeholders in the UN system. I could expand on it, but the point, I hope, is properly made. And finally, now, how can parliamentarians help people to have greater faith in the UN? Look, like you, like others, I'm a convinced multilateralism, not as an act of faith. I don't like the notion of an act of faith. This is a very pragmatic, practical commitment. We need multilateralism, not because we believe in it, but because our circumstances dictate, for all the reasons that Anne-Marie has set out, that we need to work together in ways that can address the global challenges that we face. Governments alone, has been said, cannot solve the problems. Governments acting individually cannot solve the problems. We need this collective approach through multilateralism. I'm going to come to a close. You know, the proposition that the G20 was a major innovation in 2008 sort of was based, and some people said this very clearly, that there is an inverse relationship to the effectiveness of decision-making and the number of people around the table. So 20 is a bit better than 193. And from 2008 to 2010, I think that proposition held water. I think if you look at the track record subsequently, the UN record of achievement probably stands as a major contradiction or challenge to that notion of inverse proportionality of numbers and effectiveness. I will stop now. There's lots more to be said, but I know others want to say it.
Thank you so much, Guy. I will now turn to questions and comments from parliamentarians who are on the call. If you can press your hand button so that I can recognize you. We'll go for 1 to 2 minutes question or comment, and we'll get through a couple of those. I did want to acknowledge Guy Ryder that in addition to passing budgets and legislation, they are also thought leaders and can bring people on side in their communities to get action on critical issues such as climate change, which really demands a lot of changes within countries and in processes. And the more that they can help people understand what the issues are and bring them along, the further we will be. So I do hope that we can help formalize those meetings of parliamentarians that the IPU puts on at the UN FCC meetings and COP meetings and what have you, to really make sure that they are brought into the process and fully aware and part of their ministerial delegations, which has been in several GA resolutions alone. I'm going to turn to Mr. Tontisren and ask him to please identify himself and make a 1-minute question or comment, and I'm keeping track.
2 minutes? Patty, thank
Yes.
you very much. I think this webinar is very informative and useful briefing. I believe that we should commit to multilateralism, like the UN use it as a working principle with member country, but not enough. I think we should promote the concept of multi-stakeholder approach. Parliamentarians and also private sector, professional, civil society, even people themselves, under the concept of multi-stakeholder approach. And then the second question is that Parliament and parliamentarian has very unique role, as Guy Ryder mentioned. I think we should engage more the Parliament and parliamentarian. And the third one, I think to create the trust and respect, multi-stakeholder approach should be used along with multi-strategic approach to deal with complex and challenging issues like SDG now. And also we have to emphasize a multi-stakeholder approach at multi-level approach, also global regional, national, community, and people level. So I believe we should promote this concept, broaden multilateralism to multi-stakeholder approach along with multi-strategic approach and multi-level approach to achieve certain goal collectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn to Cynthia Lopez Castro of Mexico.
Thank you so much. Well, first I want to congratulate Patty for this great meeting and in this UN committee in the IPU. And Mr. Guy Ryder, I listened to you. It's very interesting what you are saying. And for us, it would be great to have more communication. I don't know if in the International Labour Organization, you have a specific area to be in contact with Parliament, because sometimes it is very useful for us to be engaged, to be committed, as the MP of Laos was talking now, that we need to be more committed, but also we can promote some bills that you are promoting so we can know about them and promote in our country. So I will be very interested in have more engagement with your area that is being collated with Parliament. And also I'm here in Geneva, so I would love if I can meet you. It will be great. I sent you a private message, but me, that I am the president of the Forum of Women MPs, are very interested in work together, because now women is not the same salary as men, and we have a lot of disadvantages, and we would like to be working in that. So it will be great if you can, now that you are here with us in this meeting, if we can engage and we can do a lot of things together. Thank you so much. Thank you, Patty.
Thanks so much. And just an update, of course, Mr. Ryder is now the Undersecretary General for Policy for the Secretary General. So he's even in a better position to influence, although salaries are definitely something labor and business work on together. I will now turn to Farida Elimi and then to Alessandro Motter. Farida, can you please, I'm just going to ask you to unmute. Wait, you're on. Farida, you're live.
Oui, non, il n'y a pas de problème. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
J'ai la traductrice, je fais mon discours en arabe et j'ai la traductrice en français ou en anglais, comme vous voulez, en français. Je tiens à remercier, attendez, donc السيد ممثل الأمم المتحدة، زملائي البرلمانيين أعضاء الاتحاد البرلماني الدولي، السيدات والسادة المشاركين. أود في أول الأمر أن أشكر الاتحاد البرلماني الدولي وكذا الأمم المتحدة على اختيار هذا الموضوع المهم، ألا وهو تعزيز الشبكية من أجل تعددية أقوى داخل الأمم المتحدة. لابد من اغتنام هذه السانحة للإشادة بنجاحات الأمم المتحدة في صياغة وتوضيح البيانات العالمية للمبادئ والقيم كما هي مكرسة في ميثاقها وفي الإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان والسلام، وعملها الدؤوب على حل النزاعات وتصفية الاستعمار في عديد المناطق في العالم وضمان حق الشعوب في تقرير مصيرها ودعم التنمية.
Monsieur le représentant de l'ONU, chers collègues de l'UIP, Madame la présidente du Forum des femmes parlementaires de l'UIP, je tiens à remercier l'Union interparlementaire, l'UIP et les Nations Unies d'avoir choisi ce thème très important concernant le renforcement du réseau pour un multilatéralisme plus fort au sein des Nations Unies. Nous devrions profiter de cette occasion pour rendre hommage aux réussites des Nations Unies dans la formulation et la mise en œuvre des déclarations universelles et des principes des valeurs de l'ONU, telles qu'elles sont portées dans sa charte et dans la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme et de la paix. Dans son travail inlassable sur la résolution des conflits, sur la décolonisation dans de nombreuses régions du monde, garantissant ainsi le droit des peuples à l'autodétermination et soutenant le développement.
لطالما نادت الجزائر لعالم متعدد الأقطار لعالم أكثر عدالة وتمثيل أكثر نزاهة وإنصاف، كما تحرص دائما على الدفاع عن القضايا العادلة وكذا تفعيل دور الأمم المتحدة في إحلال الأمن والسلم الدوليين. لقد ظافرت بلاد الجزائر في 6 جوان الفارق بمقعد غير دائم في مجلس الأمن الدولي، وهي تتطلع الآن من خلال عضويتها الغير دائمة في مجلس الدولي لسنتين 2024-2025 الإسهام في عمل مجلس الأمن.
L'Algérie a toujours réclamé un monde plus juste, plus équitable. L'Algérie s'est toujours efforcée de défendre les questions, de défendre les questions justes, ainsi que d'activer le rôle des Nations Unies dans l'établissement de la paix et de la sécurité internationale. Mon pays, l'Algérie, occupe aujourd'hui un siège non permanent au Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU. Je profite aussi de cette occasion pour saluer les pays qui ont soutenu la candidature et qui ont salué son élection pour ce siège non permanent 2024-2025. Et ainsi, je salue aussi le travail du Conseil de sécurité et je suis confiante que sous la direction clairvoyante de notre président Abdelmajid Tebboune, président de la République, est déterminé à concentrer ses efforts pour promouvoir la paix et la sécurité internationale, revitaliser l'action multilatérale, renouveler avec les partenariats les plus importants, les partenariats et les partenaires clés, la promotion des principes et les valeurs de l'ONU, la poursuite de ses efforts de lutte contre le terrorisme et la promotion de la participation des femmes et des jeunes à ces efforts internationaux.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I have 2 more people that we're at 4 minutes for your intervention, and I did ask for 1 to 2 minutes. I will ask and hold the time for Mr. Motter and then for Tabitha Sarabo Haley, and then I will turn from Guyana, and then I will turn back to our panelists. We do have a 10 o'clock deadline. Alessandro, please unmute.
Thank you. This is a very exciting conversation for me, having spent something like 20 years in this office trying to help bring a parliamentary dimension to the UN. So I have a sort of a good view of how stakeholders interact with the UN, and I want to share a couple of observations, the lessons learned, if you will, and also for the benefit of those listening. Let's be practical. The ambassadors who sit here at the UN, who represent the governments and member states of the UN, take instructions from their capitals. Okay, I think Ambassador Akram may comment on this, but I think that's mostly correct. Therefore, the first element, the first actor at the UN is the nation state. I find missing from the high-level report this observation that is actually the core of what we do at the IPU at the UN, which is to empower our members of parliament, our parliaments, with information, with the tools to oversee the action of their own governments in their own capitals, so as to influence their government's views of what they say and do at the UN. We don't pretend as IPU to speak for 179 parliaments on every single issue of the UN here in New York. We want the parliaments to feed their views in their own domestic jurisdictions to try to struggle, if you will, with their own executive as to what should be the nation's position on certain issues, or at least to hold their governments accountable for what the government decides to do and how they cast their votes at the end of the day at the UN. So the simple observation is that a government that is not listening to its own civil society, its own private sector, its own local authorities and whatnot at home, is not likely to listen to the same entities speaking at the UN here in New York or in Geneva or Vienna. The fundamental way in which stakeholders ought to interact with the UN reflecting on our own position of the view is through their own national governments. And then let their governments speak at the UN and make their decisions. This is not to say there is no room at all for civil society and others to be here and listen and report back to their own members and also share views. But it seems to me that unless we radically change the decision-making rules at the UN, where these other actors have a vote, literally, we seem to be going on in circles. I have seen for 20 years now a cacophony of an increasing number of hearings, consultations, and processes to hear from civil society, private sectors, and others. But at the end of the day, there remains a real gap between what we hear from these actors and what the member states actually end up deciding to do at the end of the day. Precisely because, as I said, member states take instruction from their capitals, not from the private sector and civil society speaking here in New York. So that is the tension that I find in this discussion, that either we go all the way and we change the nature of the UN to make it more like the ILO, in fact, maybe where, you know, these other actors have a vote, or an actual way of struggling with their own, the government side around the negotiating table. But if we're not going there, and obviously we're not going there because we heard from the ambassador of Pakistan that this is an intergovernmental organization owned by the governments. So to simply add more consultations, I think it's kind of weakening, in a way, the UN more than strengthening the UN. So there is a critical mass of information that we need to collect, but then the member states have to make those decisions.
Thank you so much, Alessandro. I'll now turn to Tabitha, who is in Guyana, I think. Tabitha, and please unmute.
Yes, good morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
It was a pleasure being part of this discussion. I think, as I'm a young MP, I've been in Parliament for about 3 years now, and what I find difficult is the linking, exactly what I think was said before, the linking of what happens in the UN and what happens once the head of state or the decisions come back to the country. And I'm trying to follow the decisions made, follow whatever the head of state may have agreed to at the UN, and whether or not that is actually being implemented in the home country. And sometimes it's difficult to figure out whether or not what was said and agreed to is actually what is being done. And I think as a member of parliament, having access, a different level of access in that conversation would help members of parliament also push for whatever is being agreed upon at that particular level of the UN, in the parliament and on the ground in our countries. And so we can ensure that the government is moving in the direction they would have accepted and agreed to at the UN, because sometimes agreements are made, but once they get back home, something else happens. And the majority of the country is not even aware of the agreements that have been made. And I find it difficult trying to follow what exactly was the agreement that was made by the member states. And so I won't take too long, but that is basically my point. And so I agree with the approach of having more persons involved in the process, even if it's just for information purposes, so that we can know how it is that we should proceed in our parliaments, and so that we can better represent the people at home.
Terrific, Tabitha, and that's certainly what our job here in New York is to do, is to try and help with that. And that was a great contribution. Marc Bertin and Munir, I'll give you 30 seconds. That's all I got. And then I need to go back to the panelists for some closing remarks, unfortunately. Marc Bertin, s'il vous plaît, 30 secondes.
Merci de m'avoir donné l'opportunité de participer à ce panel. Je suis agriculteur et parlementaire au Burkina Faso. Et la question du multilatéralisme qui est abordée aujourd'hui me donne la possibilité de m'exprimer, de poser la question à tout le monde. Quel type de multilatéralisme faut-il vraiment développer pour que nous puissions avoir des objectifs efficients afin d'apporter des éléments de réponse quant à la vocation même du multilatéralisme, qui est axé sur un certain nombre d'actions qu'il faut mettre en place pour la paix, les valeurs, le climat et autres. Aujourd'hui, le multipartisme doit être à différents niveaux. Niveau national, niveau régional, niveau continental, niveau international. Mais le constat que nous faisons, nous en tant que pays du Sud, déjà enclavés, c'est que quelles sont les organisations qui favorisent le multilatéralisme? On les connaît. C'est les Nations Unies, l'OTAN, l'Union européenne, l'OMS, les banques mondiales, FMI. Mais est-ce qu'il y a une véritable interface efficace et sans influence entre le niveau international et le niveau pays ou continent ou région pour que nous puissions développer ces valeurs dont nous avons souhaité? Alors, c'est un cri de cœur. Moi, je suis dans un pays aujourd'hui qui est confronté à la question du terrorisme. Et les actions en faveur, effectivement, de reconquérir cette paix doivent venir, effectivement, de rencontres concertées pour que vraiment le monde entier puisse vivre en paix. En tout cas, merci, c'est un sujet très intéressant. Malheureusement, le temps imparti n'est pas suffisant, mais en tout cas, en tant que parlementaire et bénéficiaire de ces choses, je vous dis merci.
Et merci beaucoup, Marc Bertin. C'est très important d'avoir votre voix ici. I am going to ask Munir, did you have one quick question or comment? Quick. Wait, if you have to unmute.
Okay, hi, thank you for this presentation. I was have question, but now it's okay for me. It's clear.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And it's true. We could have had many, as Marc Bertin said, we could have had many more hours, and I'm sure the H Lab has had many hours. Cynthia, I know you want to get in, but I've got 6 minutes to give 2 minutes to each of the panelists to make question or comment. So, sorry. I will go in reverse order, or Ambassador Akram, would you like to go first?
Okay.
Okay.
Patty, interesting discussion. I just want to conclude by saying that I think it is necessary to clarify what we mean by multi-stakeholder participation and what we mean by network multilateralism. These are two different things we're talking about. Also, the context of multi-stakeholder participation is different. You cannot have the same approach to, say, ILO, or to address disarmament in arms control, for example, or to address terrorism. As such, I think you will not want to have multi-stakeholder participation when you're dealing with terrorism, because you will have rather unsavory characters sitting at the table. So I think that multi-stakeholderism has to be seen in every context. And of course, parliamentarians are different, and parliamentarians have a different role, and certainly they should be a part, and they are a part of the multilateral system, because they're part of the decision-making by governments as such. So I think what is important is to clarify that what we're asking is advice, information is fine. Decision-making will have to remain with member states. Thank you, Betty.
Oops, sorry, thank you so much. And it's terrific to have your wisdom and experience here. I will now turn to Anne-Marie Slaughter.
Thank you. Et je devrais parler en français, mais je regrette que je ne peux pas parler comme ça pour tout ça. I wish that I could address you as fluently in French. Let me start by agreeing with Ambassador Akram on several points. And one is, I think it is very important to think about networked multilateralism as much more than and quite different from, let's say, the World Economic Forum's concept of multi-stakeholderism, where everybody comes around a table equally and is supposed to have equal power, which they certainly do not. And so I really would urge you to read the HLAB report. It's actually only about 35 pages. And if you go online, you can see that there are 6 big shifts, and the essence of it is quite easy to digest. And the point there also is it focuses intensively on reforms to the United Nations system itself to make it more effective, particularly around inclusion, Security Council reform, turning to the General Assembly where the Security Council is paralyzed, greater use of regional organizations, cities and counties, local government participation in UN fora, and an entire section on reforming the international financial institutions. And all of that was deeply informed by a need to represent the global majority much more inclusively than is done today. So I don't think we have any disagreement on the need to build on the successes of the United Nations but fit it for this century. Second point, and here again, I agree with Ambassador Akram, and I should have made it clearer. There's no dispute that governments in the end have to make the decisions. For whatever our disagreements between states, among states, governments have greater legitimacy than any other actor. And you, as parliamentarians, are proof of that. Where you are the strongest in governments around the world, the governments are the most representative. So there's no disagreement there. There's where we may differ is that global actors, rather than government actors, need a greater role in the proposing of solutions and the implementation of solutions. But governments must be the deciders. So I want to make that clear. And let me conclude by saying, as I see this, and I sit looking out on the United Nations right now, I'm at the Ford Foundation, I think of the international system that was built in the 20th century as critical. It is the core of our multilateralism. But those buildings, all the United Nations system is embedded in this web of global actors, and they are very active. They have power to do many things independently of governments or to influence governments. And the question is how you bring those two systems together, the international one that was established in the UN Charter and the global one that has grown up as our world has gotten ever smaller. And how do you do this? And this is where I would end, in a way that makes multilateral solutions effective. Indeed, as Guy Ryder said, networked, inclusive, and impactful. And we think that if you are more mission-focused and networked and bring together these actors with specific missions in view, using the SDGs, I would start with the SDGs and then think about how do you achieve each of those goals very specifically, bringing together the relevant actors, which can include, of course, parliamentarians, for measurable progress toward multilateral agreed goals. That's what we have to come up with. We have some suggestions, but overall, it's to urge the Summit to the Future to really focus on how, through networks, through missions, through representation, you can make multilateralism more effective in addressing nuclear war, terrorism, climate change, pandemics, artificial intelligence, and all the other global challenges we face.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, and thank you for shifting your schedule to participate with us. Just before I turn to you, Guy Ryder, I wanted to mention to Marc Bertin that in the job description of the resident coordinators that are in many of the countries, there is a line there that they are to interact with parliaments and parliamentarians. And so I encourage him to reach out. That was something the IPU fought for. And while it needs to be more defined and measured in terms of that participation, we have worked, that's one of our achievements, to make sure that they are more connected to their parliaments who can help oversee those agreements and hopefully help be more nimble in these very difficult situations that are happening in many places. So with that, I'll turn to you, Guy Ryder, for the final comments.
Thanks, Patty. I know that we're already over time, so I'm going to be really very, very telegraphic in my responses. Firstly, I know that misleading parliaments and parliamentarians is a very serious offence, so thank you for correcting any misimpression I've given. I'm sitting here in New York at the UN these days. First point, is that I think from the divergences that might have been apparent in our initial comments, I think we're converging around a few very important ideas. Firstly, as Ambassador Akram has said, context and is super important as we think about multi-stakeholderism. There are different issues that we have to deal with. Multi-stakeholderism will play out in different ways, and we do need to clarify these matters. I think it was said at the outset that in some cases, all of these very, very important issues have not found the space for the types of dialogue as this one is, that we need to find common ground to move forward. So context, clarification, absolutely. My last point is it's a slightly negative one, but it's negative to move to a positive. I think we need to avoid two zero-sum traps. I detect in our conversation an underlying concern that by giving more space and more possibilities to multi-stakeholders in our multilateral processes, we would somehow ipso facto detract from governmental prerogatives. Giving more to one would be necessarily taking away more to the other, with parliamentarians sort of squeezed in the middle. I don't believe that to be the case, but we have to make sure that the way we define our proposals dispels that notion of zero-sum. And the second zero-sum trap, and it goes back particularly to the question about how parliamentarians can help. We do need to dispel a discourse which is existent in the world, that by giving more importance, by investing in multilateral processes and subscribing as nation states to the outcomes of those processes, we are somehow detracting from national sovereignty or the prerogatives of national parliaments. That isn't the case. I mean, it should not be the case in our circumstances. Multilateral action is necessarily an instrument of and a complement to, of course, critically important national democratic process. And those are, I think, the two zero sums that we need to steer clear of in our thinking and in the way we approach these problems. Thank you.
Undersecretary General, thank you so much for your comments, and we couldn't agree more. And as you speak, I'm so glad you're there. So we wish you much success in your work. And of course, this dialogue is important. Members of Parliament have a full-time job governing, helping to govern their countries. But it's great to have so many participating in the work that we're doing to insert their voices into the UN and to understand how to interact with their foreign ministers and how they can help propel those SDGs further and some of the agreements that and issues that you're talking about too, Ambassador Akram, that need to be addressed domestically as well. So to each of you, His Excellency Munir Akram, Pakistan's ambassador to the United Nations, and to Emery Slaughter, the CEO of New America, and to you, Undersecretary General Guy Ryder, thank you all very much for participating today. And hopefully we can keep this dialogue going. And we really appreciate all your time and wish you good luck in your day. And to all of you parliamentarians who participated. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Have a good day.